Hey everybody, this is John from Pioneer Nexus MTG coming at you with another deep deck dive. This time we're starting out with Bant Spirits. As a friendly reminder, if you like these informative Pioneer videos, please consider subscribing to the channel, giving us a thumbs up, leaving a constructive comment down below. So starting out with Mono Blue Spirits to kind of give a contrast of what the deck does differently from the Mono Blue lists. Mono Blue lists are much more centered on getting a Curious Obsession down and kind of tempoing the opponent out with counterspells, things like Lofty to Dial, Geist Light Snare, and just using your spells to basically keep your creatures alive. Use Curious Obsession to get some card advantage, tempo your opponent out from there, using things like Shackle Geist, tap down your opponent's creatures, and just kind of tempoing your opponent out as quickly as possible. This strategy is very good against the bigger mana decks, things like Lotus Field and Mono Green Aggro. Struggles a little bit more against heavily based removal decks, and against other aggressive decks they're backing up with removal. So decks like Humans packing some amount of removal or mono red tend to be rougher matchups for this style of deck. Looking at Bant Spirits, how it departs from this is it's a little bit higher up on the mana curve, and is using things like Collected Company to get you a little bit more leverage in those kind of in-between grindier matchups. Maybe not against like black-red and stuff, but against other decks where you know your opponent might have some amount of removal and they're killing your creatures, so something like Curious Obsession isn't as likely to survive. This deck also plays some amount of permission, with Lofty Denial still being played as a counterspell, and then Spell Queller being quite a nice card. And most importantly, this exiles mana cost 4 less. That means it can exile things like Supreme Verdict, which are obviously difficult. It can also exile Collected Companies and mirror matches, etc., and becomes a very high priority for your opponent to kill once you counter one of their spells with it. But it does give you a little bit of power, and is one of the reasons to be playing the blue-white variants. So like I said, this version is a little bit more up on the curve, and you're still playing Spectral Sailors and Mausoleum Wanderers. Obviously Mausoleum Wanderer, one of the biggest reasons to be in the blue covers to begin with, and is Spirit's best one-drop in the format. Unlike a deck format like Modern, where you're lacking things like Noble Hierarch and stuff to be able to accelerate you into things, Mausoleum Wanderer kind of becomes this effective split card of pressure plus a soft counterspell. And then, one of the other big advantages of playing the second color is you get to play not only Supreme Verdict, Supreme Phantom as a Lord, you also get to play Imperium Eagle, which other flying creatures get +1/+1. These in combination allow you to increase your pressure exponentially quickly. You still get to play things like Shackle Geist and Rattle Chains to disrupt what your opponent's doing. Obviously, Rattle Chains is a protection thing. Shackle Geist allows you to race more effectively by tapping down your opponent's biggest creatures. You can easily tap down a thing like a Niv-Mizzet or some of the big dumb green idiots to get them out of the way, allowing you to finish off decks like Mono Green if they happen to get the few blockers they have up. Selfless Spirit gives you some protection against interaction, particularly sweepers. It's pretty good. And then Skyclave Apparition gives you a little bit of interaction, much like Spell Queller, against any type of annoying permanence your opponents might have, clearing creatures out of the way, etc., helping you to erase in situations. And then we've already covered Collected Company is the main reason to splash green in this deck, and oftentimes it's the only green card you'll see in these lists. This allows you to potentially hit 2 spirits at instant speed, allowing you to recover from wraths and stuff a little bit more effectively, allowing you to play a little bit of a grindier game against decks like Mono Red and such that are trying to 1-for-1 you into the ground. This is just kind of a way to play around those effects. Beyond that, you are playing a 3-color mana base, which means you don't get the awesome things like Faithless Haven that Mono Blue has, but you do get to run a few utility lands like a Ganjo here to allow you to interact with your opponent at instant speed. And once again, some bit of this deck operates at instant speed, but a lot of this deck has to tap at main speed. You basically have Spectral Sailor, Spell Queller, and copies of Rattle Chains. That's kind of the only things you get to play at instant speed by Collected Company. Whereas if you happen to have a Rattle Chains in play, this deck changes dramatically as you're able to play everything at instant speed, and it's just something to keep in mind. Sideboard, Cemetery Illuminator here allows you to cast a spell from the top card of your library if it shares creature card type with the card exile with Cemetery Illuminator. So basically, if you exile a spell, you get to play a spell. If you exile a creature, you get to play a creature. A little bit of a way to find a little bit of card advantage, and once again, in those kind of grindy games. Mystical Dispute, very good against the blue mirrors, whether it be against Mono Blue Spirits, any type of control decks, etc. Can also be okay against Lotus Field as you're packing enough pressure to keep them under at bay. Disdainful Stroke, a lot of different things this is good at. It's good against the control decks, good against the different combo decks, both lowest field combo and mono green, and also can be very good against the Izzet decks, countering their more expensive spells, like their Delve spells and some of their 4-mana threats, especially if they happen to bring in things like Crackling Drake against you. Catilda is very important in racing situations as the flying and lifelink, and obviously can get quite large with the number of spirits and stuff you have. Redain is an interesting split card. This can both make it more difficult for your opponent to cast their expensive non-creature spells, so against control and stuff, makes their sweepers that much more difficult to cast. Against decks like mono green, makes their planeswalkers much more difficult to cast, and also is quite a good card against the Lewis Field combo decks. Archon and Portal Deafening Silence, primarily things you bring in against Izzet spell-based decks as well as Lotus Field. Selfless Spirit, we've already kind of covered, helps protect your creatures from other removal. Copies of Rest in Peace, good against any type of graveyard nonsense, whether it be the Greasefang combo decks, whether it be any other thing like that. Maybe could even bring it in against Black-Red, help slow down some of their things, like Graveyard Trespasser and Kroxa. Portable Hole, just some flexible removal against cheap creatures when you're in other racing situations. This version, a little bit different when it's trying to execute. You're still playing a lot of the same colors in the main deck. Glasspool Mimic allows you to copy whatever creature you want to copy, whether you want to copy another Lord, perhaps another Shacklegeist, another Mausoleum Wonder. A lot of different things you can hit, especially off of Collected Company, allows you to copy another copy of Skyclave. It's always nice if you ever watch the Humans decks in the modern format when they were still a thing. Having copies of Phantasmal Image was quite nice. It also allows you to run a 24th land, as is once again, this deck does require you to hit land drops 1, 2, 3, and 4 quite easily, and sometimes can even double spell. Otawaro here as the interactive thing along with a Ganjo. The mana base is a little bit tricky. You're obviously skewing towards blue and white. You're really only splashing for Collected Company in the main deck, so that is something to consider whenever you're playing your lands. One of the things here in the sideboard, this version is a little bit more geared towards removal-based decks than maybe the previous version we saw. Say Shaper Sanctuary turns one removal into an additional card draw. Distraction Specialist allows you to get back any of your 1 and 2 draw creatures, so while you're not able to get back your Skyclave Apparitions, your Imperial Eagles, or your Spell Quellers, you're still able to get back your Mausoleum Wonders and such. Another card to point out, though, is Spectral Sailor. Allows you to draw cards in the mid to late game if you happen to be getting into kind of an attrition-based game. This might be one of the last cards you want to run out, even though it is a 1-drop, just to be able to draw some cards. Lofty Denial here is a bit of soft permission. This is kind of a Jawari Disruption-esque card, and if you happen to have a creature with flying, which obviously most of your creatures are, becomes a 4-mana instead. That said, it still does have a bit of a time limit, as certain decks like Mono Green and Lewis Field can get around that, so once again you need to be backing it with pressure, which obviously this deck is built to do. And then Citadel of the Wreckage also plays nicely with your Collected Company, so your opponent doesn't know if you're holding up Collected Company to interact with them as a fellow creature deck, or if you're just going to be settling the wreckage and killing all the creatures, making racing a little bit tricky. And then Portable Hole, once again, very good against other tribal decks, decks like Humans, Mono Red, those kind of decks that are trying to race you back with what they're doing, and can be okay against Black Red. Does hit some of their early threats, mainly hitting the Vampire and Kroxa, although I would tend to lean to bring this in against decks like Mono Red and Humans. Once again, showing the plethora of cards this deck can bring in. Brazen Borrower is another flying card. While it's not a spirit, it does give you a little bit of interaction with its bounce ability. Also being a 3/1 flyer, plays quite nicely with their Collected Companies and stuff. Once again, much like the Citadel of the Wreckage, Wandering Emperor gives you yet another 4-mana play that you can play to kind of juke your opponent if they're playing around Collected Company. You can maybe get them with a Wandering Emperor. This does give you a little bit of utility against grindier decks, so it is a quite nice thing to have. Once again, you're still seeing a lot of the other same cards, so nothing too fancy here in the main deck. As far as the land base, you're still seeing a lot of the same cards, just in different numbers. Sideboard, Licensed Hearse, very nice against any type of graveyard nonsense. So whether you're playing against Red-Black, whether you're playing against Red-Black Sacrifice, whether you're playing against any type of Greasefang combo, Arclight Phoenix variants, etc. This is a very nice card to have access to. Deafening Silence, once again, very good against the Izzet decks and against the Lewis Field combo, Catilda in racing situations. Mystical Disputes we've already kind of talked about. Very good against the control decks, etc. Disdainful Stroke, once again, good against Lotus Field. Is it decks stopping their big payoff spells, and also good against the Lotus Field combo, mono green, control, etc. Just a lot of decks that are trying to play clunky playoffs. Got this one as one more example of cards. Watcher of the Spheres is a 2-drop that can make all of your other creatures cheaper to play. Whenever a creature with flying enters the battlefield, it also gets pumped for a +1/+1. So you can often play this as a 2-mana thing that your opponent has to answer. And if they don't, you get to potentially double and triple spell an turn earlier. Maybe you don't play an Imperium Eagle and a Rattle Chains on the same turn or something similar if this is sitting in play, threatening to really pressure your opponent while also making your spells cheaper, which is quite nice. A lot of versions have moved away from this card, but I figured it would be an interesting one to point out. Other versions in the past have also run things like Gilded Goose. Well, Gilded Goose isn't that good. It does allow you to go from 1 to 3 quite easily, but it's definitely not one that's seeing a lot of play right now. Sideboard, once again, we've already seen a lot of these cards. Aethergust is another one to know about. It's very good against mono green, also good against mono red, obviously. You can potentially bring it in against the red-black variants. Most of them tend to rely more on the black cards than the red. So, bring it in on your own risk that, or if you have some stuff you want to board out in those matchups. As far as what this deck is good against, it's good against a lot of the same spread that mono blue is, but not being quite as efficient about it, and trading that off by having a little bit more resiliency with Collected Company and potentially Shaper Sanctuary against some of the more removal-based heavy decks. So, you're going to be a little bit better maybe against things like black-red and stuff, just being able to recoup all the removal and stuff, and maybe a little bit better. Well, both decks are probably pretty decent against Niv overall, but you tend to struggle with the decks that are trying to match what you're doing, but being a more aggressive bat. So, mono red, humans decks, those kind of decks that can kind of race you and interact with you tend to be tougher matchups. And the decks you're trying to prey on are largely the same things. You're trying to prey on decks like Lotus Field combo. You're trying to prey on decks like mono green, and these decks that you just rely on big over-the-top spells resolving, and you just bring in a little bit of light permission with disdainful strokes and stuff, and you just tempo them out into the game. It's one of the places that Spirits kind of occupies in the meta, is they are more of an interactive combo, or interactive against combo decks or big mana decks. They tend to be very good in those situations, where maybe Old Growth Trolls and Cavalier Thorns might stonewall the entire mono red deck. This deck can just literally tap down your Cavalier Thorns and continue being faced and killing you. So, as far as what it struggles against, it tends to struggle against decks that can either get under it, like mono red, and still interact with your creatures in a meaningful way, or a deck like black red that just has all this instant speed removal and can find some arbitrary way to finish you off, whether it be the creatures like Bone Crusher Giant and Graveyard card that I'm drawing a blank on at the moment, even though I was just playing the deck on Explore. But Graveyard, various planeswalkers like Shun are coming down, killing your creatures. It's just a deck that tends to specialize quite nicely in hunting these creature-based decks. So, a lot of it comes down to is, do you want to play, have access to the Lords for a little bit faster clock, or do you want access to the mono blue deck that can run out of steam maybe a little bit faster, but has a little bit more early interaction in terms of counter spells with Geistlight Snare, Lofty Denial, Slip Out the Back, etc. A deck that's more centered on keeping its creatures alive, whereas this one's just trying to overwhelm you with such a large amount of creatures with special abilities that opponents can often get overwhelmed just from the sheer amount of flying pressure this deck applies. Both decks are trying to execute the same game plan. They're a little bit different. Mono blue tends to be a little bit better, especially in the meta when mono green's a thing. This deck might be a little bit better in more open meta, but both decks have their weaknesses in terms of being vulnerable to lots of pressure and removal, which, their matchup spread's very similar, but also this version's a little bit weaker in terms of, the decks, really wanting to hammer decks like mono green and such. So, sometimes you just want to play a deck that with a little bit more variety than mono blue. This is certainly the way to go, although it doesn't have the pedigree that mono blue has. Maybe it's because it's a little bit more expensive, maybe just simply because mono blue might be a little bit better against a certain spread of decks in the top tier. But, this is a deck to be aware of. and along with blue-white is the 3 variants of Spirits that you might see play. So let me know down in the comments what deck you might like to see next, as we're continuing to roll along with a lot of the key decks in Pioneer, although we're starting to run out of decks that most people would consider tier 1 or tier 2, but we're still trying to cover decks. There are other things to cover out there. We have things like other different control variants, you have some of the other tribal decks to cover, etc. So there's still plenty of decks to cover out there. Let me know which one you might want to see next.